The Texas frontier stretched endlessly in every direction, a harsh expanse of scrubland and mesquite that could swallow a person whole. In 1847, settlements were few and far between, connected only by dusty wagon trails that wound through territory where Comanche war parties still rode and Mexican bandits preyed on unwary travelers. It was into this unforgiving landscape that 8-year-old Emma Hartwell found herself thrust, alone and terrified, clutching nothing but a raggedy corn husk doll her mother had made for her last Christmas. The Hartwell family had been traveling west from Missouri, part of a wagon train heading for California gold country. Thomas Hartwell, Emma's father, had been a blacksmith back in Independence, but like so many others, he'd caught gold fever and convinced his wife Margaret that their fortunes lay in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They'd sold everything they owned, bought a wagon and oxen, and joined up with the Morrison wagon train, 43 families strong, led by Captain Jake Morrison, a grizzled former mountain man who claimed to know every water hole and safe passage between the Missouri River and Sacramento. For 3 months, the journey had been everything the guidebooks warned about and worse. The oxen had fallen sick crossing the Arkansas River, forcing them to trade away precious supplies for replacement animals. Margaret had developed a persistent cough that grew worse each day, and little Emma had watched her mother grow thinner and more frail as the miles stretched on. But Thomas remained optimistic, constantly talking about the nuggets they'd pan from California streams and the grand house they'd build in San Francisco. Everything changed on a scorching afternoon in September, somewhere in the vast emptiness between Fort Worth and El Paso. The wagon train had stopped to rest during the heat of the day, circled up near a small creek that provided blessed shade and water for the animals. Emma was playing with her doll under their wagon while her parents argued in hushed tones about whether Margaret was strong enough to continue the journey. She'd been coughing up blood that morning, and Thomas was talking about maybe staying at the next settlement until she recovered. That's when they heard the war whoops. The Comanche attack came swift and brutal, warriors appearing as if from the earth itself, their painted faces terrible in the afternoon sun. Captain Morrison shouted orders, but there was no time to properly prepare. Men scrambled for rifles while women gathered children, but the war party had chosen their moment perfectly. The settlers were scattered, resting, unprepared. Emma watched in horror as chaos erupted around her. Gunshots cracked like thunder, horses screamed, and people ran in every direction. She saw her father fall, a Comanche lance through his chest, and her mother collapse beside their wagon wheel, blood spreading across her calico dress. The little girl crawled deeper under the wagon, clutching her doll and trying to make herself invisible as boots and hooves thundered past. The attack lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the war cries finally faded and the dust settled, Emma found herself surrounded by terrible silence. She remained under the wagon until darkness fell, too terrified to move, listening to the wind whistle through the abandoned camp and the distant howling of coyotes drawn by the scent of blood. When dawn broke, she finally crept out to find a scene from her worst nightmares. Bodies lay scattered around the demolished wagon circle, some scalped, others mutilated beyond recognition. The surviving livestock had been driven off, wagons burned or ransacked, and precious supplies scattered across the prairie. Emma found her parents where they'd fallen, already stiff with death, their faces gray in the morning light. For 3 days, the 8-year-old girl wandered the aftermath of the massacre, surviving on scraps of hardtack and jerky she found in the wreckage, drinking muddy water from the creek. She tried calling out, hoping other survivors might hear her, but her voice seemed to disappear into the vast emptiness of the Texas plains. The bodies around her began to swell and stink in the heat, and clouds of buzzards circled overhead like harbingers of her own approaching death. On the 4th day, weak from hunger and exposure, Emma made a decision that probably saved her life. Instead of staying near the demolished wagon train, she began walking. She had no idea which direction led to safety, but she knew she couldn't survive much longer in that place of death. She filled a canteen with creek water, stuffed her pockets with what food she could find, and set off into the wilderness with nothing but her corn-husk doll for company. The Texas frontier was merciless to a small child alone. During the day, the sun beat down with crushing intensity, forcing Emma to seek whatever shade she could find among the scrub brush and scattered rocks. At night, the temperature dropped dramatically, leaving her shivering in her thin dress as coyotes howled in the darkness nearby. She walked during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, resting during the worst heat of midday, but each day her steps grew shorter and more unsteady. By the end of the first week, she was delirious with thirst and hunger. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face burned raw by the sun despite her efforts to stay in shade. The canteen had run dry 2 days earlier, and she'd been reduced to licking dew from rocks in the early morning hours. Her feet, protected only by worn leather shoes, were blistered and bleeding. She'd torn strips from her petticoat to wrap them, but the makeshift bandages were stained with blood and dirt. It was on the 8th day that she finally collapsed. Emma had been following what looked like a game trail, hoping it might lead to water when her legs simply gave out. She fell face first into the dust, too weak to break her fall, and lay there gasping in the morning heat. The corn-husk doll rolled from her grasp, its cheerful button eyes seeming to mock her desperate situation. This is where she was going to die, Emma realized with the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes to those facing their end. Alone on the Texas frontier, 8 years old, with nothing but buzzards to mark her passing. She thought about her parents, probably already bones bleaching in the sun back at the wagon train. She thought about the bedroom she'd shared with her baby brother back in Missouri, before the scarlet fever took him the winter before their journey began. She thought about her mother's cornbread and her father's strong hands lifting her onto his shoulders. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, Emma closed her eyes and waited for death to take her. She was too weak to cry, too dehydrated for tears, but a small whimper escaped her cracked lips. It was barely audible, more breath than sound, but in the vast silence of the prairie, it might as well have been a shout. That's when she heard the horse. The sound of hoofbeats approaching made Emma open her eyes, though she could barely focus. Through the shimmering heat waves, she saw a rider approaching, a lone figure on a painted pony, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Rescue at last. But as the rider drew closer, that hope turned to fresh terror. The man approaching was Comanche. He was tall and lean, his copper skin marked with scars that spoke of countless battles. His black hair hung in braids decorated with feathers and beads, and his face was painted with yellow and red stripes that made him look like some ancient war god. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, with a rifle across his saddle and a bow slung across his back. This was one of the warriors she'd been taught to fear above all others, a member of the tribe that had destroyed her family and left her to die in this wasteland. The Comanche warrior dismounted and approached her slowly, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard ground. Emma tried to crawl away, but she had no strength left. She could only lie there, clutching her doll, as he knelt beside her and studied her with dark eyes that revealed nothing of his intentions. He spoke in his own language, words that sounded like wind through grass, then switched to broken English. "Little white girl," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you are dying." Emma managed a small nod, unable to speak through her parched throat. The warrior, he looked to be maybe 30 years old, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, reached for a water skin at his belt. He supported her head with one hand and brought the water to her lips with the other. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but to Emma it was sweeter than honey. She drank greedily, though he only allowed her small sips, speaking softly in Comanche as she rehydrated. When she'd had enough, he examined her sunburned face and blistered feet with the practiced eye of someone who understood survival in harsh country. "I am two bears walking," he said in his careful English. "What is your name, little white girl?" "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emma Hartwell." Two bears walking nodded gravely, as if committing her name to memory. He looked around at the empty prairie, then back at her. "Where is your family?" "Dead," Emma managed. "All dead, the wagon train, your people." She expected anger or perhaps satisfaction, but Two Bears Walking's expression remained neutral. "Many die on the warpath," he said simply. White eyes, numunu, all the same to the spirits. The strong live, the weak die. This is the way. He studied her for a long moment, and Emma found herself looking into eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. This man was her enemy, one of the people who had killed her parents and destroyed her world. By all rights, he should finish what his warriors had started. But instead, he was giving her water and speaking to her with unexpected kindness. You are strong, little Emma Hartwell, Two Bears Walking said finally. 8 sons you have walked the land of the dead, and still you breathe. The spirits have marked you. He stood and walked back to his horse, leaving Emma lying in the dust. For a moment she thought he was abandoning her, leaving her to die as she'd expected. But he returned with a bundle of jerky and what looked like some kind of root vegetable. He gave her small pieces to chew, warning her to eat slowly, and more water to wash it down. As her strength began to return slightly, Emma found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. Are you going to kill me? Two Bears Walking was quiet for a long time, staring out at the horizon where heat waves danced like spirits. When he finally spoke, his words changed everything. I had a daughter, he said softly. She would be your age now. The blue coats came to our village 3 winters ago. She died with her mother when the soldiers burned our lodges. He looked down at Emma with something that might have been sadness in his ancient eyes. Perhaps the spirits brought you to me for a reason, little white girl. Perhaps they mean for you to take her place. Emma didn't understand all the implications of what he was saying, but she recognized salvation when she saw it. This Comanche warrior, this enemy of her people, was offering her something no one else could, a chance to live. As the sun reached its zenith and the heat became unbearable, Two Bears Walking fashioned a simple shelter from his saddle blanket and some scrub branches. He settled Emma in the shade and sat beside her, sharing his water and food while the worst of the day's heat passed. And slowly, carefully, he began to tell her what her new life would be like if she chose to accept his offer. The choice, he made clear, was hers to make. The decision facing 8-year-old Emma Hartwell was impossible for someone her age to fully comprehend. Stay with Two Bears Walking and live as a Comanche, abandoning everything she'd ever known about civilization and her own identity, or refuse and almost certainly die alone on the Texas frontier. As she lay in the meager shade of the warrior's makeshift shelter, sipping water and nibbling jerky, the full weight of her situation began to sink in. Two Bears Walking seemed to understand her confusion. As the afternoon heat shimmered around them, he spoke quietly about what life would be like in his band. He told her about the seasonal movements following buffalo herds, about the skills she would need to learn to survive on the plains, about the family that would adopt her if she proved worthy. His English was limited but clear, and he painted a picture of a life completely foreign to everything Emma had known. You would be Numunu, he said, using the Comanche word for the people. White skin, but Numunu heart. You would learn our ways, speak our tongue, follow the path of the buffalo. Your hair would grow long, your skin would darken from the sun, and in time you would forget the white man's road. Emma clutched her corn husk doll tighter, trying to imagine herself as one of the painted warriors who had killed her parents. The thought terrified her, but the alternative, dying alone in this vast wilderness, terrified her more. She was too young to understand concepts like cultural assimilation or the psychological impact of trauma, but she was old enough to recognize that two bears walking represented her only chance of survival. "What about my mama and papa?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "Will I forget them too?" Two Bears Walking was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless prairie. "The dead walk in the spirit world," he said finally. "They watch over us, but they do not need us to remember the white man's words or the white man's ways to love us. Love lives in the heart, not in the tongue that speaks it." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Two Bears Walking made his preparations to leave. He had been scouting for buffalo sign when he found Emma, part of his responsibility as a hunter for his band, and he needed to return with information about game movements. He could not delay much longer without raising questions from his war chief. He helped Emma to her feet, steadying her when she swayed with weakness. Her legs felt like water, and her vision blurred with the effort of standing, but she managed to stay upright. Two Bears Walking studied her critically, assessing her condition like a horse trader evaluating livestock. "You are weak," he said bluntly, "but you have the spirit of a survivor, this I can see." He gestured toward his horse, a sturdy paint gelding with intelligent eyes. "You will ride with me, but first you must choose. Come with me and live as Numunu, or stay here and join your parents in the spirit world. I will not ask again." Emma looked around at the desolate landscape, then at the warrior who had found her. She thought about her parents, cold and still back at the wagon train. She thought about the life they had planned in California, the gold they would never find, the house they would never build. All of that was gone now, as dead as the dreams that had brought them west. "I'll come with you," she whispered. Two Bears Walking nodded, showing no surprise at her decision. He lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, settling her in front of him on the saddle. Emma had never ridden bareback before. Her family had owned a gentle mare back in Missouri, but she'd always used a proper saddle. The paint horse's movement felt strange and uncertain beneath her, but Two Bears Walking's strong arm around her waist kept her secure. They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, covering ground at a steady pace that ate up the miles. Two Bears Walking seemed to know exactly where he was going, following landmarks invisible to Emma's untrained eye. They passed through dry creek beds and over low hills covered in scrub brush, always heading northwest towards some destination known only to her rescuer. As they rode, two bears walking began teaching her basic Comanche words. Puha meant horse, Pai was water, Tukamapu meant eat. He repeated each word patiently until she could pronounce it correctly, correcting her pronunciation with gentle firmness. Emma found herself surprisingly eager to learn, perhaps because it gave her something to focus on besides the overwhelming change in her circumstances. When darkness fell, they made camp in a shallow depression that provided shelter from the wind. Two bears walking built a small fire using techniques Emma had never seen before, creating flame from nothing but steel, flint, and dried grass. He shared more of his jerky and some kind of dried fruit that was sweet and chewy, and gave her water from his skin whenever she asked. That first night sleeping under the stars beside a Comanche warrior was the most frightening experience of Emma's young life. Every sound made her jump, the crack of cooling rocks, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the brush. Two bears walking seemed to sense her fear, and he began singing softly in his own language, a haunting melody that somehow made the darkness feel less threatening. "Sleep, little white girl," he said when the song ended. "Tomorrow we reach my people and your new life begins." But sleep did not come easily. Emma lay wrapped in two bears walking spare blanket, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear desert air, and wondered what she had gotten herself into. She thought about the Comanche raids she'd heard about back in Missouri, the stories of torture and scalping that had made her mother keep the curtains drawn tight on nights when the wind howled like war cries. Now she was voluntarily riding toward a Comanche camp, trusting her life to one of the very people she'd been taught to fear above all others. They rose before dawn and continued their journey, riding through a landscape that gradually began to change. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, and Emma caught glimpses of a river winding through cottonwood trees in the distance. Two bears walking pointed toward a column of smoke rising from behind a low ridge. "My people," he said simply. As they crested the ridge, Emma got her first look at a Comanche camp, and it was nothing like the savage encampment she'd imagined. Below them spread perhaps 30 tipis arranged in a rough circle, their buffalo hide walls decorated with painted designs that told stories she couldn't read. Children played in the grass between the lodges while women worked at various tasks, preparing food, tanning hides, mending equipment. Men sat in small groups, talking and smoking, their weapons close at hand but not threatening. Dogs wandered freely, and dozens of horses grazed in a makeshift corral at the edge of camp. It looked, Emma realized with surprise, remarkably peaceful, almost normal. The arrival of two bears walking with a white child caused immediate commotion. People emerged from their tipis to stare, and Emma found herself the center of attention from dozens of curious eyes. Some of the looks were hostile, but others seemed merely curious. Children her own age peered at her from behind their mothers' skirts, whispering among themselves in rapid Comanche. Two bears walking dismounted and helped Emma down from the horse. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly, which drew some laughter from the watching children. But two bears walking steadied her with a firm hand on her shoulder and led her toward the center of camp, where an elderly man with gray braids and numerous scars sat beside a small fire. This, Emma realized, must be the chief. The conversation that followed was entirely in Comanche, rapid and animated, with frequent gestures toward Emma. She caught a few words she recognized from her riding lessons: white and found and dying. But the bulk of the discussion was incomprehensible. The chief studied her with sharp eyes that missed nothing, taking in her sunburned skin, her torn dress, her blistered feet. He asked questions that two bears walking answered at length, and gradually Emma became aware that her fate was being decided by men whose language she couldn't understand. Finally, the chief spoke directly to her in heavily accented English. "You are the white girl my son found dying on the sacred ground." "Yes, sir," Emma replied, falling back on the manners her mother had drilled into her. The chief's weathered face showed the ghost of a smile. "I am Bear Claw, war chief of this band. Two Bears Walking is my eldest son and a great hunter. He tells me you have chosen to live as Numunu rather than die as white. Is this true?" Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. "Living as Numunu is not easy for one born white," Bear Claw continued. "You must learn new ways, speak new words, forget old habits. Some of my people will not accept you. Some will try to make you prove your worth through pain and hardship. Are you strong enough for this?" Emma thought about the 8 days she'd spent alone on the prairie, about watching her parents die, about the choice between a hard new life and certain death. "I think so," she said quietly. Bear Claw studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We will see. Moon that shines, come forward." An elderly woman emerged from the crowd, her gray hair braided with silver ornaments and her dress decorated with elaborate beadwork. Despite her age, she moved with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect, and Emma instinctively felt that this was a person of importance in the tribe. "This is my sister," Bear Claw explained. "She lost her granddaughter to the white man's spotted sickness 2 summers ago. She will decide if you are worthy to take that child's place in her lodge." Moon that shines approached Emma slowly, her dark eyes taking in every detail. She walked around the girl like a horse trader examining a potential purchase, knotting the calluses on her hands from helping with wagon train chores, the straightness of her spine despite her exhaustion, the way she met the older woman's gaze without flinching. Finally, she stopped in front of Emma and spoke in heavily accented English. "You have known hunger," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am." "You have known fear." "Yes, ma'am." "You have known death." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." Moon that shines nodded slowly. "Good. Fear makes us careful. Hunger makes us grateful. Death makes us strong. You will live in my lodge and learn the ways of the people. You will help with the work and care for the horses. You will speak only Numunu tongue until your English words are forgotten. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "I am not ma'am," the old woman said sternly. "I am Paya, your grandmother. You will call me Paya and honor me as granddaughter should honor grandmother. Your white name is dead. Your white life is dead. Tonight you will be given a new name, and tomorrow you will begin to learn what it means to be Numunu." As the crowd began to disperse, Moon that shines, Paya, led Emma toward a tipi decorated with painted horses and buffalo. Emma looked back once at two bears walking, who nodded encouragingly, then ducked through the entrance flap into her new home. The interior of the tipi was surprisingly spacious and comfortable, with buffalo robes arranged around a central fire pit and personal belongings stored in painted rawhide containers. The walls were decorated with weapons, tools, and clothing, everything organized with obvious care. An older man sat near the fire, working on what appeared to be a bow, while a woman Emma's mother's age ground corn in a stone bowl. "This is Gray Wolf, my husband," Paya said, gesturing toward the bow maker. "And this is Singing Bird, my daughter. They are your family now." Gray Wolf looked up from his work and studied Emma with the same careful attention his wife had shown. He spoke in Comanche, and Paya translated. "He says you have the look of one who has walked far and seen much. He says this is good. Soft children do not survive the hard seasons." Singing Bird set aside her corn grinding and approached Emma with a gentle smile. She was younger than Emma's mother had been, perhaps 25, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. She knelt in front of Emma and spoke in careful English. "You are safe now, little sister. We will teach you to be strong." That evening, the entire band gathered for Emma's naming ceremony. She was led to the center of the camp, where a large fire had been built, and the people formed a circle around her. Bear Claw spoke at length in Comanche, his words carrying the weight of ritual and tradition, while Emma stood nervously in the firelight and tried to understand what was happening to her. Finally, Paya stepped forward with a bowl of what appeared to be paint mixed with water. She dipped her fingers in the mixture and began painting symbols on Emma's face, stripes on her cheeks, a circle on her forehead, lines along her jaw. The paint was warm and smelled of clay and herbs, and Emma tried to hold perfectly still as the old woman worked. "You are no longer Emma Hartwell," Paya announced in English, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That child died on the sacred ground where my son found her bones. You are now little dove who flies far from home. You are Numunu. You are my granddaughter. You are one of the people." The crowd began to chant, a rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, and several men began to dance around the fire. Emma, now little dove, watched in fascination as the ceremony unfolded around her, marking her transition from one world to another. The firelight flickered on painted faces, and the chanting grew louder, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her, as if the last threads connecting her to her old life were finally being cut. When the ceremony ended, Paya led her back to the tipi, where Singing Bird had prepared a meal of buffalo stew and corn cakes. Little Dove ate hungrily, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal since before the wagon train massacre. The food was different from anything she'd eaten before, gamier, more flavorful, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but it was delicious and filling. As she ate, Gray Wolf began to speak in slow, careful Comanche, pointing to objects around the tipi and nomming them. "Tipi," he said, gesturing to the lodge itself. "Kasu," pointing to the fire. "Pa," indicating the water gourd. Little Dove repeated each word, trying to get the pronunciation right, while Singing Bird smiled encouragingly. That night, wrapped in soft buffalo robes and listening to the sounds of the camp settling down for sleep, Little Dove thought about the incredible journey that had brought her to this place. Just days ago, she had been Emma Hartwell, daughter of Missouri blacksmith, dreaming of California gold. Now she was Little Dove who flies far from home, granddaughter of a Comanche war chief, beginning a life she could never have imagined. She still missed her parents terribly, and the grief sat like a stone in her chest, but she was no longer afraid. Two bears walking had been right. She was strong enough to survive. And maybe, just maybe, she was strong enough to become something entirely new. The transformation of Emma Hartwell into Little Dove who flies far from home began with the sunrise following her nomming ceremony. She woke to the sound of camp stirring to life, dogs barking, children laughing, adults calling to each other in the musical cadence of the Comanche language. For a moment, wrapped in the warm buffalo robes, she forgot where she was and expected to see the familiar canvas walls of her family's wagon. Then reality crashed back, bringing with it a mixture of grief and bewilderment that made her stomach clench. Paya was already awake, moving quietly around the tipi as she prepared for the day. She had changed from her ceremonial dress into practical working clothes, a simple buckskin dress decorated with shells and beadwork, sturdy moccasins, and her gray hair braided with colored strips of cloth. When she noticed Little Dove stirring, she spoke in careful English. "Today you begin to learn. No more white words after the sun sets tonight. Only Numunu tongue. You understand?" Little Dove nodded, though the prospect of abandoning English entirely filled her with anxiety. It was her last connection to her parents, to the world she'd known before. But she'd committed to this path, and there was no going back now. Singing Bird had already left the tipi, and Gray Wolf was nowhere to be seen. Paya explained that the men had gone to scout for buffalo sign, while the women would spend the day preparing for a possible move. The band followed the great herds, never staying in one place long enough to exhaust the grass or water. This constant movement was the heartbeat of Comanche life, and Little Dove would need to learn its rhythm. The first lesson came immediately. Paya handed her a worn buckskin dress that had obviously belonged to another child, along with soft moccasins decorated with blue and white beads. "Your white clothes are dead like your white name," she said firmly. "Numunu girl wears Numunu clothes." Little Dove struggled out of her torn calico dress and petticoat, the last physical remnants of her former life. The buckskin felt strange against her skin, softer than cotton but heavier, and it carried the scent of smoke and prairie grass. The moccasins were more comfortable than her battered shoes had been, molding to her feet like a second skin. When she was dressed, Paya nodded approvingly. "Good, now you look like granddaughter, not like white captive." The distinction, Little Dove was beginning to understand, was crucial. Captives were tolerated but never fully accepted. They remained outsiders, always suspect, always less than full members of the tribe. But adopted children, especially those taken young enough to fully assimilate, could become as Comanche as anyone born to the people. The difference meant survival versus mere existence. Paya led her out of the tipi and into the bustling activity of the camp. Women were everywhere, working at dozens of different tasks with practiced efficiency. Some were dismantling tipis, rolling the heavy buffalo hide covers and bundling the long poles for transport. Others were packing household goods into parfleches, decorated rawhide containers that could be easily loaded onto travois. Children helped with age-appropriate tasks, while bobbies napped in cradle boards that could be carried on their mothers' backs. "You watch, you learn," Paya instructed, then launched into a rapid explanation of tipi construction that was half English and half Comanche. Little Dove tried to follow along, but the technical vocabulary was challenging even in English, and completely incomprehensible in the native language. Still, she watched carefully as the women worked, noting how they folded the hides to prevent cracking, how they arranged the poles for easy transport, how they secured everything with rawhide ropes. Her first real test came when Singing Bird called her over to help with the horses. The Comanche were legendary horsemen, and their wealth was measured in the size and quality of their herds. Every family owned multiple horses for different purposes: war horses, hunting horses, pack animals, and the swift ponies used for buffalo running. Even children had their own mounts, and riding skill was considered as essential as walking. Singing Bird led Little Dove to where a dozen horses stood hobbled near the camp's edge. They were beautiful animals, mostly paints and pintos with a few solid colors mixed in, all showing the sturdy build and intelligent eyes of horses bred for life on the plains. Singing Bird spoke in slow Comanche, gesturing toward the animals and repeating words until Little Dove began to understand. Puhayuka, Singing Bird said, pointing to a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze. Your horse. You learned to ride Numunu way. Little Dove had ridden before, but always with a saddle and bridle on her family's placid mare back in Missouri. These horses wore only simple rope halters, and riding them would require an entirely different set of skills. Singing Bird demonstrated, swinging onto her own mount with fluid grace, then gesturing for Little Dove to try. The first attempt was a disaster. Little Dove managed to get one leg over the mare's back, but she had no idea how to balance without stirrups or a saddle horn. She slid off the far side and landed in the dirt to the amusement of several watching children. But Singing Bird was patient, showing her how to grip with her knees, how to move with the horse's motion, how to use her weight to guide the animal. By the end of the morning, Little Dove could stay on the mare's back at a walk, though her balance was still precarious. Her legs ached from gripping so hard, and she had grass stains on her new dress from multiple falls, but she was making progress. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that among the Comanche, horsemanship wasn't just a skill, it was an identity. To be Numunu was to be one with the horse, to move across the plains like the wind itself. The language lessons continued throughout the day as the band prepared to move camp. Every object, every action, every concept had to be learned in Comanche. Nabita for moving camp, Quakerabuma for packing, Neakama for leading horses. Paya was relentless in her instruction, correcting pronunciation and demanding constant repetition. When Little Dove lapsed into English, as she inevitably did when tired or frustrated, Paya would stop what she was doing and stare at her until she rephrased her words in Comanche. The most difficult part wasn't the vocabulary, though that was challenging enough. It was the fundamental difference in how the two languages approached the world. English, with its precise tenses and structured grammar, carved reality into neat categories. Comanche was more fluid, more concerned with relationships and processes than with static definitions. A horse wasn't just puha. It was puhayuka if it was your horse, puhatua if it belonged to someone else, puhamop if it was a war horse, and dozens of other variations depending on context and relationship. By afternoon, the entire camp was in motion. The dismantled tippies had been loaded onto travois, A-frame sledges pulled by horses, along with all the household goods and personal belongings. Children too young to ride were secured in cradle boards or nestled among the baggage. The horse herd was driven by young men who rode with the casual skill of people born to the saddle. The whole operation had taken less than 4 hours, transforming a settled village into a mobile community ready to follow the buffalo. Little Dove rode her mare near the middle of the column, with Paya keeping a watchful eye on her progress. The pace was steady but not rushed, designed to cover ground without exhausting the animals. As they traveled, Paya continued the language lessons, pointing out landmarks and explaining their significance in Comanche history and culture. "There," she said, gesturing toward a distant butte, "enemy warriors killed 3 of our young men 2 summers ago. We remember their names when we pass this place." The butte became not just a geographical feature but a repository of tribal memory, a monument to loss and a reminder of ongoing conflicts with other tribes and with the expanding white settlements. Everything in the Comanche world, Little Dove was learning, was connected to everything else. The movement of buffalo herds determined where the band would travel. The seasonal patterns of grass and water influenced when they howl.